Welcome everyone to the first talk of the season for CIDP, where I'm Stephanie Martel. I'm the director of the Center for International and Defense Policy, and I'm very happy to welcome my colleague Amarasingam to talk to us about dangerous conspiracies, why some bad ideas produce violence. Before we begin, let us acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. Amarasingam is an assistant professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. His research interests are in terrorism, radicalization and extremism, conspiracy theories, online communities, diaspora politics, post-war reconstruction, and the sociology of religion. Dr. Amarasingam has published widely. I won't be naming all of his publications. He has over 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, in addition to a few books. He is an experienced field researcher, having conducted hundreds of interviews on social movement activism, organizational dynamics, and youth identity in Sri Lanka, throughout the former war zones of Sri Lanka, but also Syria, Iraq, Morocco, Somalia, Lebanon, and Israel-Palestine. He co-directed a study on foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq based at the University of Waterloo, during which he conducted numerous social media and in-person interviews with current and former foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. He also, more recently, I believe, conducted several interviews with former extremists on the far right and conspiratorial movements. And this is what he will be talking to us about today. And, yeah. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks to Stephanie and the CIDP for the invite. They say there's no such thing as a free lunch, except today, I guess. I will be talking a little bit about conspiracy theories and some of the recent surveys that we've been conducting in the UK and in the US, just in terms of what the roadmap looks like. So as Stephanie mentioned, the title is Dangerous Conspiracies, Why Some Bad Ideas Produce Violence. I want to do two things today. First, kind of provide a sense of what conspiracy theories are and why they're kind of important and why people believe in them, and then give you a snapshot of two kind of surveys in the UK that we've done on kind of varying aspects of conspiracy theory and their intersection with political ideas and violence. We've replicated the survey in the US, but all that analysis is still going on. I would really like to conduct it at some point in Canada. So I'll pass around a collection plate in case you want to financially contribute. And then we'll end with the kind of so what question at the end. Basically, what I want to kind of talk about is some ideas suck, right? But sometimes they, in addition to sucking, can also produce a lot of violence. And why is that the case in terms of how things play out? Don't know if this is working. Okay. So just as an introduction, what are conspiracy theories? This is actually an important question because a lot of times I see conspiracy theories defined in ways that are not exactly conspiracy theories. So I tend to break it down into three integral components. One is a belief in a sinister group of conspirators. Most often, of course, with conspiracy theories, these are the Jews, but other times can be communists, can be this kind of nebulous elites, big pharma, the CIA, etc. Right? So some sort of sinister group of actors has to be doing something bad, and this evil group is generally kind of orchestrating all that happens for their own benefit, and so everything is kind of connected. So it's not just a school shooting, it's an orchestrated plot to take your guns away, right? So there has to be some sort of action that they're all engaging in. And nothing is as it appears is also kind of a key component. And for many of these people, for many conspiracy theorists, they see themselves as kind of a righteous vanguard on the front line of these movements, right? So I've interviewed a lot of ex-QAnon people, for example, who will say, when I was in the thick of it, I thought I was saving the world, right? I thought I was tasked with saving the world, awakening a sleeping masses, waking up people to the true kind of true reality of what was going on. So this is kind of the key component I think that needs to be put into our definitional apparatus, because the sinister actors are actually kind of important. So if I believe, for example, that the COVID vaccine produces infertility, that might be just a piece of misinformation, right? That's not necessarily a conspiracy theory. But if I believe that the COVID vaccine was manufactured to cause infertility by a shadowy group of people, now you're in the realm of conspiratorial thinking, right? So I think sometimes people, I've seen in other surveys, but also journalistic accounts, they remove the sinister group aspect of it and just talk about it. And then there's this weird confusion between misinformation and conspiracy theory. So the sinister group is quite important. What kinds of conspiracy theories are there? Michael Barkin's kind of classic breakdown, I think, is still pretty good. It's a bit dated at this point, but it's still pretty good. He talks about event-related conspiracy theories. So these are things like the JFK assassination or the 9/11 attacks. You know, Epstein didn't kill himself. That sort of things, event-related to specific things that actually happen. There are kind of broader systemic conspiracies, usually to do with control over a particular country, a region, entire world. So these are things like the Illuminati, Jewish plots to take over the world, Jewish plots to manipulate the financial markets, etc. COVID conspiracy theories also have this kind of flavor to them. And then when you kind of combine those two, he calls them super conspiracies. So these are often nested within each other, right? So individual events are kind of nested into systemic conspiracies to produce this kind of everything is connected global cabal of things. And so QAnon is a good example of this in the way that it kind of vacuums up everything that it touches and incorporates it quite seamlessly into its own conspiracy. What's happening? Okay. Okay. All right. No. One back if you can. Okay. So why do people believe in conspiracy theories and why are they attractive? There's a lot of work on this. Karen Douglas, for example, breaks it down into three kind of motives, which I think are also pretty somewhat dated, but also pretty useful. She talks about epistemic motives. So these are kind of the desire to understand why big events happen. So associated with this are things like proportionality bias. We have a kind of psychological need for big events to be caused by big causes. So when you say that the Twin Towers were brought down by a bunch of guys with box cutters, it's not psychologically very satisfying, right? We need it to be, no, it's a global cabal of something or other. So, you know, JFK, with the president of the United States, is assassinated by some dude in a book depository, not psychologically satisfying, right? It needs the cause of the event and the size of the event and the cause of the event need to be somewhat aligned for them to be kind of useful and provide explanatory value. Existential motives, these are generally finding ways to reduce the chaos of information. When big events happen, they usually require some sort of explanation. Timothy Melley calls this agency panic, right? So this idea that we've lost control of events, and conspiracy theories really come in to kind of give you a sense of control. They give you someone to blame. They give you a cause for why something happened. And of course, social motives. This is what I've been studying most, is like what happens in these online communities to keep people part of these online communities, right? So online QAnon spaces, for example, you know, they love each other. Right? They go on dates, they get married, they give each other money, they take risks for each other. And so being part of these online communities is massively rewarding in and of themselves. And this is why when something like Q stops posting, they can just find another thing to be concerned about, find another thing to be concerned about, because it's actually the community that matters, and perpetuating that friendship is actually what matters. So that's kind of the introduction to conspiracy theories. What we're looking at now mostly is why do some of them produce violence and others don't. So you know, there are mountains of conspiracy theories. Obviously, Elvis is still alive. Paul McCartney has secretly been dead for years. The Loch Ness Monster, JFK assassination, moon landing was faked, Area 51. None of these has ever produced an instance of violence to my recollection, right? But why do other conspiracy theories, you know, Tupac is still alive and lives in Cuba, that one's probably true. But why do some of them produce violence and others don't? That's kind of the question I want to explore today. So when you look at something like Pizzagate, you had a gentleman in DC basically storm the pizzeria at Comet Ping Pong. I think it was 2017 now, because he was convinced that there was a child sex trafficking ring in the basement of this pizzeria. When he got there, he realized that there's not only no children there, but the restaurant doesn't have a basement, right? And then he later told investigators that I may have gone too far down the internet rabbit hole, right? Understatement of the year. QAnon, of course, has produced hundreds of attacks. Michael Jensen at START in Maryland has counted hundreds of attacks and violence related to QAnon, from kidnappings to killings to property damage and so on. Great Replacement theory, of course, the idea that usually Jews, but sometimes liberals and elites are slowly replacing the white population in Western countries through immigration policies and other means, has produced quite a few attacks, from the Christchurch attack to the Buffalo shooting to the El Paso shooter in Walmart. The Christchurch attack manifesto was literally called the Great Replacement. And so several attacks have been associated with this. The Great Replacement kind of fear that the majority is being slowly replaced by some sort of sinister minority population also exists in other parts of the world. Myanmar, the way that the radical Buddhists in Myanmar talk about the Rohingya population is as in similar language of they're having too many kids, they're sterilizing our population in secret. The way that Sinhalese Buddhists in Sri Lanka talk about the Muslim population in that country is also very similar. And the way that white nationalists talk about immigration from Syria and so on in parts of Europe is also kind of very much Great Replacement-y, right? So it looks different in other parts of the world, but it's having kind of outsized impact. And of course, things like the protocols, the Elders of Zion, which basically talks about Jews as secretly plotting global takeover, influencing the financial markets and the banking system, subverting nations and sovereignty, and so on and so forth, which has led to countless pogroms and violence over the years, including influencing the Holocaust. And so why, unlike Elvis is alive, are some conspiracy theories more prone to produce violence than others? And I don't have an answer, but I have some explanations, which we'll talk about. So what we've done over time, so me, Paul Gill, and Bettina Rottweiler out of the UK have looked at this question in multiple ways, but I'll just talk about the surveys for today. One of them was a 2022 survey, which we looked at COVID conspiracy theories and violence. Yeah, can you go next slide? Yeah. So it was a nationally representative survey in 2022 with 800 participants, equal gender split, mostly white, representative by age, gender, ethnicity in the UK population. And what we wanted to find out was if you held COVID conspiracy theories, and what were there any personality traits that kind of mediated support for anti-government violence and support for violent extremism, right? So it's really about finding the kinds of risk factors from a personality point of view, or protective factors from a personality point of view, that could mediate this relationship between COVID beliefs and support for anti-government violence, right? So these are our COVID measures. COVID-19 is a biological weapon created to eliminate the overcrowded human population. COVID-19 is not worse than the ordinary flu, but the government and scientists deliberately exaggerated the severity of COVID-19. COVID-19 vaccines cause serious health conditions, and the government is deliberately covering this up. These are just some of the measures that we used, and people had to answer on a Likert scale between strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? And we just took the last two, the agree or strongly agree, for our findings. In terms of support for anti-government violence, they had to again score agreed to strongly agree on is it justified to use violence against government or police, forcefully enter government or state buildings, form anti-government militias, and a whole host of other lists that we asked them about. In terms of personality traits, we kind of depended on the tried and true dark tetrad matrix that a lot of people use. I should note that last time I gave this talk, somebody said, "You're not a doctor. You can't call somebody a psychopath." I said, "Yes, I know. That's not what we're doing here." But this is a scale that's often used in psychology to say, are people more or less, again, this is individually chosen, right? Identifying on the scale that are kinds of narcissistic style behaviors or psychopathic behaviors. We're not medically saying that they're narcissists or psychopaths. It's more of a research metric. So Machiavellianism is largely kind of characterized by manipulation, deceit, focus on one's own interests, narcissism, focus on oneself, lack of empathy, and so on. Psychopathy, lack of empathy, remorse, tendency towards kind of impulsive activities, and sadism, finding pleasure in the discomfort or suffering of others. So we would ask a certain list of questions, and they would choose between a strongly agree or strongly disagree on this scale. So in terms of findings, quite interesting. If you agree or strongly agree with COVID-19 conspiracy beliefs, and you scored highly on the narcissism scale, your support for anti-government violence is through the roof, right? Is off the charts. So what this shows is, and the same thing we found for Machiavellianism, right? So if you hold COVID-19 beliefs and you kind of score highly on Machiavellian tendencies, your support for anti-government violence is through the roof. So what this means is the ideas by itself, and I'll be repeating this over and over again, the ideas by itself are somewhat important, but it's actually the cocktail that makes the difference, right? It's a mixture of personality traits, mixture of conspiracy beliefs that produce sentiments towards violence, or so at least support for violence. Any questions on that before we move on? Anything specific on that study? Okay. 2023, we did the same thing, but with very different, with a whole host of other conspiracy theories to try to look at how things would play out. So 1,209 participants, again, funded by Crest and working with Bettina and Paul, nationally representative, again, for age, gender, and so on. We asked this time, I'll focus a little bit on the anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs because those are the ones we've analyzed the closest. So, when we ask questions like, or when they were given statements like, Jews routinely use the blood of non-Jewish, mainly Christian children for religious purposes, 1.6% of men agreed or strongly agreed with that in the UK. The Holocaust was largely made up in order to serve Jewish interests and secure the state of Israel, 1.4%. I'll just kind of skip through some of these. Jewish elites deliberately advance an extreme liberal agenda to cause social and moral ills in this country, 2.9%, bordering on 3%. Considering the UK population is 70 million people, we're talking about fairly large numbers of people who are like, that sounds about right. In terms of, and it gets kind of worse from here when we say Jews are secretly attempting to establish a secret world government, 2.8%. Jewish people have controlled international affairs for decades, such as finance, politics, as well as the media and film industry. They secretly advance a sinister agenda, 6.1% of the UK population, right? And so this is largely just descriptive statistics on how many men and how many women agree or strongly disagree with statements like these. Then we looked at whether holding anti-Semitic beliefs makes you more likely to hold other bad ideas. The more you hold anti-Semitic beliefs, are you more likely to hold other kinds of beliefs? Turns out very much so. Anything over 0.5 here is considered to be a very strong correlation. So there's a very strong correlation between holding anti-Semitic beliefs and also believing in the Great Replacement theory. And so the Great Replacement theory scale, just to give you some context, and these are kind of scary numbers as well, quote, white people in the UK and wider Europe are being deliberately replaced by immigrants, Muslims, and other people of color. 10% agreed or strongly agreed with that. Global elites and Jews are deliberately bringing about population change in white majority countries by encouraging immigration and violence against white people, 5%. There is a deliberate campaign underway to erase and erode white culture in the UK and wider Europe, 11%. Right, so the more you hold, those are just the strict numbers, but the more you hold anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the more you also strongly agree with Great Replacement theories. And there's a moderate correlation with violent intentions as well, right? So these are, as opposed to what you saw earlier, which is anti-government sentiment, these are violent extremism sentiments. So these are I statements, right? So no longer I support other people to do this, but these are things that I would do personally. So these are statements like, I would be willing to threaten, harass, or intimidate people to defend and fight for my group or group's political, religious, or social goals. I would help plan illegal and violent acts to defend and fight for my own group's political, religious, social goals, and so on and so forth. So the more you hold anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the more, not massively correlational, but somewhat also supportive of violent extremist intentions. And these are I statements. These are, I will personally be willing to do these things. So that gets a little scary. Then it gets more scary. What if you add political orientation to this situation? So we asked people on an 11-point scale, again, whether you identify personally as politically left or politically right. And we just took the 1, 2, and 3 on the left and 9, 10, 11 on the right. So like fringes, right? So not anyone in the middle, the moderates, anyone who thinks that they're politically moderate. And this is kind of interesting, right? So anyone who identifies as kind of hardcore right wing or on the political left of the spectrum or the right of the political spectrum are much more likely to believe in all of the statements I read earlier about anti-Semitism than those on the left. Right, so and the numbers are quite stark in terms of how different they are. So 0.6% versus 7.9% when it comes to a statement like advance an extreme liberal agenda, cause social moral ills to this country. We found this a bit strange because there are leftist activists who I think assumed that would agree with some of this stuff, but turns out not so much. Next slide. Yeah. And so Jews have controlled international affairs for decades, such as finance, politics. 9% of the population who identify on the right as politically right. So again, we're just kind of complicating what these ideas actually do, because it's not so much the ideas that you hold, but a mixture of those ideas in interaction with your political beliefs and in interaction with your personality traits that seems to make all the difference. Right. Okay. So let's put it all together. If you hold anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs and you are right on the political spectrum, your support for violent extremist intentions is quite literally off the charts. Right. And if you identify as left, it's a little bit tempered. You have to keep in mind that the difference between 3 and 4 is an entire agree or disagree bar, right? And so we're talking very different kinds of answers. Even though on the chart it looks like they're close together, it's actually very different sentiments that you're seeing. So the more you hold anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs and you identify as politically right, the more you're likely to support violent extremist intentions. Very similar when it comes to Great Replacement theory in terms of your intention to kind of, or your support for violent extremist intentions, again, quite literally off the charts. So the cocktail is what matters. Just some quick findings on QAnon, which are actually quite interesting in the UK as well. This chart shocked and blew us away because we generally think of QAnon as a right-wing movement. Pro-Trump, Trump is a savior, yada, yada, yada. But it turns out when you ask the UK population about QAnon, there's not a whole lot difference between left and right in terms of believing in QAnon style sentiments, which is kind of strange considering most on the left wouldn't say Trump is a savior, but I guess in the UK it's a bit different. We're interested to see what this looks like with the US survey, but that's still in the works. But these are people who agreed or strongly agreed with statements like there is a deep state embedded in our governments that operates in secret without oversight, or elites from governments in Hollywood are engaged in a massive child sex trafficking ring who try to control politics and media. Right? So not subtle, not a confusing statement that they might have been giving confusing answers to, but not a whole lot of difference in terms of the left and the right. But where things get interesting, next slide, back one, is when you add the violent extremism and anti-government sentiment to it. If you believe in QAnon conspiracy beliefs and you also identify as left, that's when the violence comes in, right? So very similar dynamics that we're seeing across the board in terms of sprinkling a little right-wing identification, sprinkling a little dark personality traits, and then holding conspiracy beliefs seems to make all the difference. So what do you do with that? Next slide. And then next slide. So this is where things get complicated because we've done some work with Google and Facebook who've often asked, when can you know a conspiracy theory is going to produce violence? And so because for them it's actually a policy question of takedown and things like that, right? So when can we know that we're in the presence of a bad idea that might produce violence so we can take it down, right? So and so this goes back to QAnon because for 2016, 2017, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter didn't take down QAnon accounts, and they were allowed to grow, allowed to metastasize, allowed to have influence. And then January 6th happens, and then everyone's freaking out, right? And so then a lot of these social media companies are asking now, when should we have drawn the line? The problem is this doesn't give you that answer, right? Because this is the literal finding of this is the ideas by itself are probably meaningless. So seeing a social media post on Facebook and taking it down might make sense in hindsight, but at the time it may not. Anything can metastasize depending on the cocktail to produce violence. So what do you do with that, right? So Susan Benesch, who many of you may know out of Harvard, has something called the Dangerous Speech Project, where she talks about this very thing, right? It's when does speech become dangerous? And I've kind of started to adapt her framework to conspiracy theories as well. She says a lot of things matter, right? So it's not just that a bunch of speech was happening in Rwanda to eventually lead to the genocide, but all of these other things had to be in place. So the speaker matters, right? The status of the political, religious, or cultural leader, how influential they are. They can be anonymous sometimes. Sometimes that makes them more influential. QAnon is a good example. We still have no, I mean, we kind of know who Q is now, but we still, it's not proven. Audience matters. So it's not just the speaker and the message, but who's listening. Are they kind of already primed for violence? Are they already polarized? Is there already a kind of fearful, are they already fearful of other groups and the out group? And so the message kind of, where's the message landing? What is the historical political context of where these messages are circulating? So if you take QAnon and put it into the US, but you remove 4 years of Trump slowly eroding trust in these institutions, what happens to QAnon outside of that context, right? So all of these kind of have to come together to produce some sort of violence. And I think we can probably add, personality traits, political orientation. And he has some interesting work on the medium as well, right? So in Rwanda, she says the radio mattered for causing the genocide, right? It wasn't the internet, it wasn't TV, it was that all this was put through the radio, and it got to a certain group of people and the masses because it tapped into the medium that everyone was using. And so that also gets wound up in whether something is influential or not. So that's it. Oh, exactly 30 minutes.
All right. We have 30 minutes for Q&A. Anybody would like to start? I would just ask you to use the little mic here and pass it around for the sake of our online audience and introduce you.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a master's student in political studies here. So do you think your research accounts for a view of conspiracy theories that understands them as like an expression of like a deeper mistrust of like a given institution or political system? Like the thing that comes to mind is, some people have explained the conspiracy theories about the COVID vaccines, at least in the US, about related to like just a general mistrust of big pharma, and given how much they sort of profiteer off sickness in general, and understanding that they were profiting, from the making of the vaccines, and so that sort of was translated. The idea is that idea is like translated into a conspiracy theory that there's nanobots or whatever in the vaccine, but what's really being said is we don't trust these companies. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. I think when you watch the online conversation, and I mean kind of the darker online conversations around COVID, you realize the online community side was quite important, right? Because they would say things like, I don't trust this vaccine because I don't trust Fauci. There's probably something in it, or it hasn't been studied well enough for me to take it. But then in the online community, they would start talking about ivermectin and hydrochloroquine, right? So what that tells me is exactly what you're saying, is that they trust this community more than this community. So it's not so much what they don't want to put in their body. It's that I don't believe you, and I believe this online community of completely anonymous people who don't know each other. But I'm much more willing to receive information from this community who I feel like I'm more aligned with than this community who has a history of lying or and so on. So this is where they kind of the kind of parallel communities that are now developing in online spaces are quite important, because it's not just a place people go to get information, but it's become these trusted collectives where what's being said on them becomes important. And why that's dangerous is because that mutates into other issues, right? So if you now look at the same COVID conspiracy communities, they're now talking about the assassination of Nijar in Canada and the conspiracy theories around that, right? So now we're a trusted group of people who consume news and comment on it, and now we're just going to talk about whatever issues is the next thing, and all of it is seeped through with misinformation, right? And so as these communities grow, and that becomes where the trusted piece of information comes from, then we're living in different planets, right? Where democratic discourse becomes very difficult, because now where our sources of information are very different. Where we find trusted information is very different. So that's why, like, during the convoy, was a good example, is like all of these guys, they had 200 followers. Like Pat King had 200 followers before the convoy. At the end of the convoy, he had 300,000, right? And so now there's much more people listening to whatever he has to say next. And that's true for all of the people that were organizing. And so, yeah, these trusted collectives are just bigger now than they were. And I think COVID had a lot to do with that. Yeah. So trust is fundamental, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to invite that one. Yeah, my question is super fascinating, but where do we go from here? So who's doing research on how to address those things from a government perspective, from our education system perspective? How do we address it? Do we know if the stats in Canada would be similar to the UK, age group, employment type, that kind of stuff would be interesting to see. Now that we know how serious and concerning it is, where does that take us to address it?
So I've been trying to do a similar study in Canada, but it's a bit more difficult in terms of funding and so on, but I'm hopefully that works out. In terms of solutions, it's very difficult because I mean there's a lot of studies on why people are drawn to conspiracy theories, but much less on how people left these ideas. And so I've been interviewing a few ex-QAnon people to try to get at some of that, but it's there's not much on how people leave these ideas. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think how to combat these bad ideas is still kind of very much dependent on things like digital literacy and education, which of course is part of the solution, but also too broad to know what that means, right? So yeah, teaching kids how to consume information, teaching kids how to navigate when they're in the presence of bad sourcing and things like that is of course beneficial. Teaching adults how to do that is of course beneficial, but I think there's, as I was saying earlier to the earlier question, it's not so much the content anymore. It's like you're part of a community that believes this stuff, and so it's not just like hitting one piece of misinformation with a counter information that matters. It's they're in an ecosystem which needs to be tackled as an ecosystem, which is very hard to do. Yeah. No. Stephanie knows I barely come with good news.
Thank you. My name is Muhammad Ali. I'm in the Cultural Studies Department, PhD. I'm just wondering, what is the relationship between former problems, like, for example, or rather former and current problems, such as maybe white supremacy, for example, or issues of racism, and how does that, connect with the conspiracy theories? I mean, there was something on the Great
Replacement.
Yeah, the Great Replacement. And I'm just wondering, like, is there like a connection? And if it's there, then how big is it? And also, just to follow up on that, we live in an age where if you don't, for example, read anything, you're uninformed. But if you read, you end up being disinformed or misinformed. So, and I mean, there is a small group of people who can actually remove what is true and what is false. Now, how will we address that? I mean, what guidelines can be put in place in the internet or stuff like that? Thank you.
I mean, to your first question, I think the context part is huge, right? I mean, there are a lot of studies that came out of the U.S., for example, that African American communities were much more vaccine hesitant than white communities, and that has a history, Tuskegee onwards, right? And so that context and background and mistrust and distrust matters, and that needs to be addressed properly. So that's definitely in there with most of these communities. In terms of what has been shown to work, and I guess going back to your question too, is kind of interpersonal relationships matter, right? So my wife's a pediatrician, and she has a lot of vaccine hesitant people come in talking about autism and vaccines and so on, but she finds that personal relationship, I've been your kid's pediatrician for 5 years, and I'm telling you that that's not true, goes a long way, right? Because there's like that trust built into that relationship, which is much better than like posting something on Facebook that counters it, right? And so that personal relationship with someone you trust, your doctor, etc., seems to work a little bit. But again, how do you scale? How do you scale that across the country? Is a challenge.
Hi, Allison. I'm a visiting fellow with Fulbright here at the Center for the Year from the States, so super interesting to hear some states' perspectives in that as well. With that, maybe thinking about your comments about social media and kind of fringe groups, as well as the past research you've done on fringe groups on their own sites. What dangers do you think maybe are present from smaller social medias that are developing, such as Truth Social, which basically is something that Donald Trump is on, or other fringe sites and social medias? Do you think there's an increase in the potential for violence in those groups specifically and further radicalization, or do you think in a way they lose almost their mainstream communication on the main social medias? But just curious in your thoughts on social media in general.
I think both of that is true. So I've seen both of it happen. On the one hand, it's yeah, they're in an echo chamber now. They communicate with each other only. And sometimes that is a radicalization multiplier. But I've also seen the opposite happen, which is like they get exhausted, and so they're like, well, we have no one to argue with anymore. Like because part of what forms the in-group identity is pointing at the out-group and saying, I'm not that. But if all of you agree with each other, then it kind of becomes nothing, right? It's just a chatter. And so they've actually tried very hard. This is why I think when Elon Musk came and took over Twitter, that was quite a rejuvenation for them, because they all came back to Twitter now. And now it's arguments, like it was in 2015, right? And so that in-group, out-group dynamic is quite important for forming your own sense of argument and community. And so on Truth Social, on Gab, on Telegram, sometimes that doesn't exist, and it's not satisfying. It's not satisfying not to yell at somebody, right? And so you might believe you hold the truth, but it's only in battling it out that becomes solidified. And so so I've seen both happen. What I will say in terms of the violence part of it is a lot of that doesn't happen in public, right? It doesn't happen on Gab and chat on Truth Social and things like that. It's actually in much more exclusive forums on Telegram, sometimes made up of 15 people, where you see actual plots and attack planning and things like that happen. So they're not going to usually do that unless I guess you're the Proud Boys and make videos about it. But usually it's removed from that public eye. So yeah, I've seen it both ways. It can get a little frustrating for them to just talk to themselves.
Oded Clive from the Department of Political Studies. I think this is a great study, and I want to first congratulate you on this. And I hope you're successful in the other surveys as well. I do have quite a few thoughts, and I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. So first, I'm not sure that the conclusion that ideas are meaningless is as decisive as you put it. I think ideas are not enough, but they're not meaningless. And one of the things you might consider is looking at what social movement theory has developed in terms of resources available, opportunity structures, if you want to know when they turn into violence. It's not just the ideas, but who can actually do it, who has got the training to do it, who's got the financial capacity to do it. And that, I mean, it could be an avenue. So that's one thought. The second thought that I found, the finding that I found very interesting is in the UK, that the ideas are particularly salient with people on the right, less so on the left. And you found it surprising given what happened in the UK and Jeremy Corbyn and everything. To some extent, this may have to do with the way in which the question is worded. And I would, if you have the opportunity in the United States or in Canada, when you're conducting a survey, replace, maybe do an experiment. Some people ask them those questions using the word Jews. The left knows better than to say Jews are responsible for this. But if you replace it with Zionists or pro-Israel lobby, you might find this with using the same tropes. You might find that the support becomes far greater. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, I think the comment about social movements is quite important because, yeah, the mobilizing structures in social movement literature is very important. I mean, the growth of QAnon is fundamentally linked to that, right? So if you remember the history of QAnon, it started on 4chan. Started on 4chan. It was picked up by two influencers, very minor influencers on YouTube, who amplified it. From there, someone on Alex Jones's team picked it up and put it on the Alex Jones show. And who watches the Alex Jones show in 2015? The Trump team. The Trump team then picks it up and makes it a major talking point, to the point where he's asked about it on the debate stage in 2020, right? And so that's the trajectory of this tiny dumb idea in a dark corner of the internet making it to the debate stage. And that's all because of the mobilizing structures at play, right? All of these media structures that the right had built up, this alternative media sphere that they built up, aim to amplify this whole thing. So no, that's key. In terms of the Jewish question, I've been told I've been told that before, and it's something to maybe play around with. That the way we phrase the anti-Semitic question might be I don't know, capturing not capturing certain populations, but we'll see. Yeah, see how to play with that.
Well, if there are no other questions, then please join me in thanking Dr. Amarasingam for a great talk. And you're welcome to help yourselves to lunch.